Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for Digitizing the First Mile, Technology and Shipping. We're going to give everyone just another minute or two to join and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay everyone, thanks for waiting. My name is Rennie from CB Insights and I'll be walking you through a few housekeeping items before turning it over to Natan for the presentation. First, please don't worry about taking notes as we'll be sending both the slides and recording within 24 hours of the briefing. Second, if you have any technical difficulties during the briefing, your best bet is to reach out to the Citrix Help Desk. You can also tweet at us or send an email to webinar@cbinsights.com and we'll do our best to help. But again, please don't worry too much as we'll be sending everything out afterwards. So as with all of our briefings, we'll be moving through a lot of data and insights and doing it fairly quickly. But we also want to make sure we're answering your questions and keeping our conversation today relevant. So throughout the briefing, feel free to ask us questions using the Questions tab within GoToWebinar or via Twitter using the hashtag #ShippingTech. A little bit on CB Insights. We are a data science and machine learning organization backed by Private Growth Equity and the National Science Foundation. We track every private company in the world and all of the investment and financing activity related to them to help our clients answer questions about major trends, competitor strategy, potential disruptors, and much more. Here you can see just a few of our happy customers. The CB Insights community has many benefits, including exclusive access to top events. This includes Future of FinTech, which is our annual conference focused on the disruption of financial services, and Councils, which is our peer-to-peer networking forum for senior business leaders. For more information about our upcoming events, go to events.cbinsights.com. So a little bit on our analyst today, Natan Reddy. Natan is an intelligence analyst at CB Insights, where he produces data-driven analysis and reports on the areas of retail, supply chain, and logistics, and e-commerce, among others. His research has been cited in TechCrunch, CNN, Forbes, the Los Angeles Times, and more. Before CB Insights, Natan worked as a business valuation senior associate at Anderson Tax in San Francisco, where he valued dozens of startups and public companies. Natan is a graduate at the University of California, Berkeley, with a major in economics and a focus in French. Now I'm going to hand it off to him for the presentation.
Thanks, Rennie, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to our CB Insights research briefing on technology and shipping. I'm Natan Reddy. I'm an analyst here at CB Insights, and I'll be taking you through the presentation today. So while people often talk about technology and last mile delivery, we don't often talk about the first mile, which is another word for the global trade supply chain, which transports goods from manufacturers and growers to businesses around the globe. Today, specifically, we're going to be touching upon some of the trends we're seeing in ocean or maritime shipping innovation. We'll first introduce you to the space before taking you through some developments taking place at each stage of the shipping journey. And we're finally going to conclude by discussing how innovation in maritime shipping affects other players further down the supply chain. So without further ado, let's dive in. So to give you some perspective on the importance of ocean shipping in today's world, over 90% of goods around the world that are shipped internationally are shipped by ocean. And of course, ocean shipping is part of a much larger global trade supply chain that works to transport all sorts of goods and materials across the globe. That supply chain is exceedingly complex and contains a number of players such as manufacturers, warehouses, freight forwarders, ports, retailers, and even more. We'll touch on some of these players during the presentation, but it's actually important to remember that, as I stated earlier, we're specifically going to be discussing tech innovation that's taking place in the ocean shipping part of this process. That sits squarely in the middle of the chain, as you can see on the slide. So to start, a major issue in maritime shipping to begin with, and the greater global supply chain, is lack of general visibility for those looking to ship. So for instance, when a retailer is shipping apparel from China, if there's any delay in that shipment, they oftentimes might have a struggle tracking that shipment down. And this can obviously cause inventory issues or issues delivering orders to customers. For instance, as well, when major shipping carrier Hanjin collapsed and went into bankruptcy in late 2016, it caused many of their ships to be shut out of various ports around the world, causing thousands of containers of cargo to be stranded at sea. Many of the owners of the stranded freight had trouble tracking down their shipments, and it caused a lot of economic disruption. And beyond lack of visibility, there's also issues surrounding cybersecurity, as well as general supply chain management and flexibility, given recent tariff developments taking place. And over the last few years, we've actually seen an increase in news and media buzz surrounding maritime supply chain innovation. And I'm now going to jump into our CB Insights platform to show you how I actually discovered that. So go to our top search bar, search supply chain. Along with technology or startup. Take a look at our news tab, and you can see right here large increasing trend that we see taking place all the way back from before 2014. I want you to take note of this really notable spike in news media mentions back at the end of 2016. That can somewhat be attributed to the collapse of Hanjin, which I just discussed on the previous slide. That seemed to drive greater attention towards maritime innovation and the real necessity for visibility in the space. So for startups innovating the maritime supply chain space, although there's been a little bit of a slowdown in funding this year, we've generally seen investor interest increase over the past several years in the space. This year in particular, one of the most notable startups, Flexport, which we're going to discuss a little bit later on in more detail, raised a $100 million round of funding from notable investors, including First Round Capital, earlier this year. So as we take you through the rest of the presentation, we're going to highlight tech innovation taking place throughout the shipping journey, which we've simplified into three primary steps for the sake of the presentation. The first being booking and management, the second being transportation, and the third being port-related operations. And just for more information for yourself, this journey really represents a highly simplified view of the maritime shipping supply chain, which is a small part of the greater global trade supply chain, which we discussed earlier. So for instance, when customers are looking to ship goods, it must go through a freight booking process before the goods are taken from a port to a ship to another port before they're then distributed further down the chain. Just keep that in mind as we take you along through the rest of the presentation. And as we take you through some of these trends, I also want you to take notice of some of the overarching themes that we're witnessing, specifically a drive by innovators to increase visibility, connectivity, and automation. So from the perspective of visibility, we're seeing startups and corporates leverage different types of technology, including software, AI, IoT, and more, to help different supply chain players gain greater oversight and understanding of their operations. From the perspective of connectivity, we're seeing certain players, from startups to even ports, looking to better connect other players along the global shipping supply chain. And from the perspective of automation, we're actually seeing startups and corporates look to automate the physical act of shipping itself. So as we guide you through this presentation, I want you to also keep in mind these themes. We've placed small markers denoting these three themes in the top right-hand corners of certain slides where we find them especially relevant. So now diving into the shipping journey, let's take a look at how technology is influencing the freight booking and management process. So traditionally, when someone is looking to ship goods, they have to go through a complex network of intermediaries to help find the cheapest freight rates available. Unfortunately, this process is typically driven through emails, phone calls, spreadsheets, and even relationships between different players. As freight rates are constantly in flux, it's really hard for anyone to really guarantee that they're truly locking in the lowest freight rate. And accordingly, we are seeing startups leverage software to help streamline this overall process. One of the most well-known startups in this field is Freightos. The Israel-based company actually aggregates freight rate data into an online SaaS platform and lets those looking to ship goods receive a price quote and book a shipment in just a few minutes. And this month, they actually partnered with Lufthansa to offer a similar e-booking service for air freight as well. And what's important to remember about startups on this slide in particular is that they're leveraging technology to streamline communication between existing supply chain players. However, this isn't always the case for other startups in the space. Some startups are specifically seeking to displace traditional incumbents, and these are the ones that tend to act as digital freight forwarders. But first, just to take a step back, what actually is freight forwarding? Freight forwarding is the logistical management of freight as it moves across the global supply chain. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, when anyone is looking to transport goods across the globe, they have to go through different intermediaries. Freight forwarders are one of those primary intermediaries. So for example, when a large retailer or brand is ordering material from China, a freight forwarder like DHL will coordinate the movement of goods from the manufacturer in China to a warehouse, to a port, to a ship, to another port, and so forth until it's delivered to its final destination. The freight forwarding industry has been traditionally very low tech, and there's been a lot of low visibility into the overall process, and hence we're seeing a number of digitally native freight forwarding startups pop up. So here are a few: Freight Hub and Fleet. But another one that's really probably the most well-known is Flexport. Flexport provides real-time freight logistics capabilities to all of its clients. It allows them to track goods through their dashboard and have better communication with different supply chain players that they're working with. What's interesting about Flexport is that it's a prime example of how maritime shipping and supply chain innovation can have a far-reaching impact down the supply chain into other types of businesses, especially those that are consumer-focused. So for one, many of its clients are already smaller but well-known consumer brands like Warby Parker and Casper. Two, Flexport, as of last year, is aiming to offer speedier trade financing to its customers. Trade financing is the upfront cost needed to be paid by companies looking to ship freight, and it's often very prohibitive. So when smaller, e-commerce or consumer-related businesses apply for trade financing, they're often rejected at a much higher rate than larger multinational corporations. This often keeps them from participating in international trade. So if Flexport is able to actually provide speedier trade financing, it may set a precedent for enabling smaller companies to participate in global trade. And thirdly, Flexport has positioned itself as an alternative to using Amazon, which has also recently entered the freight forwarding space. Flexport's argument is that a Warby Parker, for example, would not want to provide all of its manufacturing and supply chain information to Amazon, who, although may not be a direct competitor to them now, could be in the future. So Flexport offers a quote-unquote safe alternative to this dilemma. And as these digital freight forwarders like Flexport pose a direct threat to traditional freight forwarding incumbents, we've seen these incumbents begin to develop their own in-house technology to compete digitally and attempt to offer some of the same services that these startups also offer. So most recently, for example, in May of this year, DHL came out with a new visibility technology dubbed My Supply Chain, which allows customers to gain access to an end-to-end supply chain management software that helps provide shipment tracking, data analytics, help optimize general operations. And it's a product that definitely harkens back and tries to emulate what these digital freight forwarders already provide. So the ensuing battle between freight forwarding incumbents and freight forwarding startups is going to be an interesting one to follow. In the short term, what this competition is doing is driving an excess of tech innovation within the space. And the first people to benefit from that are going to be those looking to ship. So retailers, CPG companies, and others. they now have access to a whole host of supply chain visibility technology coming from these different types of freight forwarders that they didn't have access to just a few years back. And as to who will win out, in one camp, many feel that the relationships, knowledge, and historical understanding of the space that traditional forwarders have is irreplaceable. They feel that if a traditional forwarder begins to integrate technology, such as what DHL is already doing, it should be a no-brainer for a shipper to use them if they're looking to ship goods. On the other hand, some feel that the digitally native startups really have a leg up on future tech innovation, given the fact that supply chain is going digital. That might be a really important strength to have. And as I mentioned a few slides earlier, Amazon entered the freight forwarding space back in early 2017. While we haven't heard too much news from them since, it's prudent to keep an eye on their future activity as they've more aggressively moved into the greater third-party logistics space over the last year. And the tech giant remains a potential threat to both incumbents and startups due to its established scale and its technical expertise. So now moving on to the next stage of the shipping journey, transportation. From a software perspective, startups like ClearMetal are integrating AI into transportation management. Specifically, ClearMetal offers clients data-driven insights into the transportation process, and the company helps predict which shipment carriers will help provide the most reliable service and helps to estimate the risk of transportation delays based on data. And beyond transportation management software, we've seen startups focusing on fuel efficiency gain extra relevance over the last several months. Specifically, the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, which is a branch of the United Nations, enacted a limit of a 0.5% cap on ocean fuel. Currently, the global sulfur cap is 3.5, and the 0.5% cap is going to take place in 2020. Given that the average marine fuel burned today is approximately 2.7%, this is actually going to be a significant challenge for the maritime industry to actually adhere to this new regulation. So accordingly, we're actually seeing a lot of buzz in the space for fuel efficiency related startups, two of whom are Nautilus and We4C. And here's a quick stat talking about how instituting such a sulfur cap limit could actually prevent 150,000 premature deaths and millions of asthma cases globally each year. So now moving on to our next trend in transportation, we're now going to be talking about the rise of blockchain in shipping. So this is a pretty hefty subject. We'll try to explain it in a way that makes sense. Blockchain for shipping began to gain notoriety after Maersk launched a study a few years ago in which it discovered that it took a stack of over 200 communications between 30 different parties just to ship a box of flowers from Kenya to Rotterdam. The study found there was a high level of inefficiency during the transportation process, and it was bogged down by excess paperwork, and it left open the door to greater miscommunication, delays, and even fraud. Accordingly, Maersk decided to partner with IBM to incorporate blockchain distributed ledger technology into the shipping process. The idea being that every actor in charge of transporting goods can communicate through a digitally secure distributed ledger that couldn't be tampered with. This would guard against fraud, increase connectivity among these different supply chain players, save time, and allow for the overall better tracking of goods. The idea has taken a strong foothold in the greater maritime shipping industry, and as you can see, there's been a variety of different initiatives. These are just a select few over the past year, and they involve a number of different players, from carriers to tech companies to insurance companies and more. However, one of the main obstacles ahead of true blockchain integration into maritime shipping is standardization, meaning that all the supply chain players would have to be on the same page regarding what type of distributed ledger technology that they're actually using. If blockchain is really to be successful in shipping, everyone will really have to be on the same platform, or these different platforms that are being developed will have to be interoperable. However, if that is achieved, we could see an increase in the efficiency of global trade, a decrease in fraud, and an improvement in the overall tracking and transparency of goods, which is really an important factor, especially when trying to understand the history of where a good comes from, its provenance, or especially when detecting, for instance, if there's a food outbreak and you need to find out very quickly where the source of that food contamination is coming from. And beyond blockchain, another further out area that we see in maritime shipping transportation tech is autonomous shipping. Most recently, Rolls-Royce Commercial Marine, which is working heavily in the autonomous shipping space, sold itself to maritime equipment supplier Kongsberg for over $660 million. The acquisition is going to be a welcome addition to Kongsberg that is looking to become a powerhouse in the autonomous shipping space itself. So Kongsberg recently also partnered with another shipping supplier to start a new autonomous shipping venture dubbed Masterly this past spring. And additionally, Kongsberg plans to build the world's first fully electric and fully autonomous container ship by 2020. So be on the lookout for that. And while full autonomous shipping truly might be a little bit further out, we are seeing startups take baby steps towards that direction. Meaning, for example, startup Shown, which has already raised $4 million to date, is working with existing ships to outfit them with autonomous technologies to help aid onboard crews. And it's already actually working with major carrier CMA CGM. And while still relatively far out to really tell, some of the main impacts of autonomous shipping on the greater maritime industry would include greater operational safety of their ships, seeing as the majority of accidents are caused by human error. It would also lead to a reduction in overhead costs because there would be smaller crews on board or possibly no crews at all. Many autonomous ships, like I just mentioned, are highly energy efficient, or either designed to be electric or be really energy conscious, and that would lead to extra cost savings. And finally, cargo capacity on ships might actually increase as areas previously occupied by human crews would no longer be needed in theory. So now moving back onto land, we're going to take you through the next step of our shipping journey and take a look at how ports are having an impact on the greater shipping and supply chain space. Ports around the world have been a driving force behind automation and technology integration in maritime shipping, and the Port of Rotterdam specifically has worked to automate much of its operations already, installing anything from electric cranes to self-driving trucks. Most recently, the company partnered with IBM also to incorporate AI and IoT tech into its operations, and both partners estimate that this might eventually save ships an hour of berthing time at port. This could have implications down the supply chain. For example, the overall cost to ship goods could actually go down through the Port of Rotterdam at least, as they'd be spending less time in the port. And additionally, inventory for all sorts of businesses would be more quickly delivered to their final destination, helping to boost overall operational efficiency for many of these businesses. And beyond port automation technology itself, we're also seeing ports act as a driving force behind startup innovation in the greater maritime shipping and supply chain space. The ports Singapore, Rotterdam, and Hamburg have all backed or started maritime-related VCs, accelerators, or incubators that have collectively supported dozens of startups, as you can see on the slide. And now for our final summary, I'm just going to take you through a quick chart that will sort of demonstrate how innovation in the greater shipping, maritime supply chain space actually affects the rest of the supply chain. So this chart here is meant to help demonstrate how maritime shipping innovation affects existing global supply chain players. And as you can see, it doesn't only affect shipping carriers and freight forwarders, but also truckers, retailers, consumer goods companies, among others. For instance, as we mentioned previously, retailers and consumer goods companies directly benefit from an influx of visibility technology into the freight forwarding space, as they're now able to better manage and better quickly change different factors about their supply chains. And this is of critical importance today because if you're dealing with macroeconomic issues such as tariffs, supply chain flexibility is incredibly important to maintaining profitable operations. And I think what this overall demonstrates is that while supply chain innovation may not always be the most discussed item in the news, it's one of the most important pieces of the global economy that really still remains invisible to most consumers, who are ultimately going to be impacted by everything that we just discussed in this presentation. So today that concludes our presentation. I want to thank everyone for listening. We're now going to open it up to some questions. All right, so I'm now taking a look at just some of the questions that are coming in here. I'm going to pick a few to answer for all of you. So here's one. It's pretty interesting. How does 3D printing affect the global shipping supply chain? All right, so that isn't a topic that I explicitly covered in the webinar today. However, what I want to point out is that technology like 3D printing could actually have a pretty significant impact on container shipping, in the sense that currently many retailers, for example, will have much of their inventory manufactured in China, and they will use container ships to then transport it across the sea to wherever they're located. If 3D printing develops to the point where you can locally manufacture all of your clothing, that could, in a sense, negate the necessity of needing to ship anything from China to begin with. So from that perspective, yes, I think it definitely impacts shipping. However, I do always think there's going to be things that need to be shipped across. So things like food and raw materials, etc. So I wouldn't say that it would completely make shipping disappear or anything like that. Well, let's take a look for our next question. Okay, here's something I touched on a little bit. What are the greater impact of tariffs on shipping innovation technology? So, as I stated before, towards the end of the presentation, I think tariffs are a really prime and current example of why supply chain visibility and flexibility is really important. Currently, if you are a retailer and your supply chain is really dependent on a particular country or a particular item that suddenly has a really hiked up tariff for whatever you're trying to import, that can cause a huge disruption to your business, to your pricing model, etc. And so having the ability to be flexible and move your supply chain around or find alternative sources to gain the materials that you need is of the utmost importance. And if you are currently operating your supply chain through just phone calls and faxes and emails, and there's really no understanding of the greater sense visibility of what's going on, or using data to understand trends or whatnot, you aren't going to be able to very quickly maneuver your supply chain or find alternatives that you need to find in order to keep your business up and running. So having the ability to use either a startup like Flexport or the digital technology that some of these incumbents are coming up with is crucially important to having greater oversight and the ability to manage your supply chain. And we'll take one more question here. Okay, this is interesting. So do you think autonomous shipping will really become a large thing, so to speak, in the maritime shipping space? I'd say it's still a little bit far out to tell, but one thing that's interesting is that the IMO, an entity that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is the International Maritime Organization, which is a division of the UN, last year had agreed to consider changing their regulations to accommodate autonomous ships. Currently, international regulations don't really consider the idea of autonomous shipping and the types of rules that they have for in international waters. And recently, earlier this year, they actually agreed on a definition for an autonomous ship. So I think the idea that they're even considering, changing with greater international rules and regulations to accommodate autonomous shipping means that, yes, it's a serious thing to consider that will probably be happening in the next, several years. But it's just important to understand that full autonomous shipping en masse might be a little bit further out, but you might start to see elements like the startup shown, which is taking baby steps in that direction, where you have semi-autonomous ships, for example. All right, that concludes the question and answer portion here. But I want to thank you all for listening again today. If you have any other questions, feel free to tweet at CB Insights or at me, or to email me at nready@cbinsights.com. And have a great day. Thank you.